Hello and welcome to our lecture on stream of commerce doctrine, a kissing cousin of direct and indirect effects. So first of all, we should define what stream of commerce doctrine is. This is a bit complex. Now remember we said that Congress cannot regulate a thing that is indirectly related to commerce. It can only regulate it when it enters interstate commerce. So it's easy for something like sugar or steel, right? Sugar is refined. Then it is sold to someone who packages it and then distributes it to consumers, right? But what about other things? It's very difficult sometimes to figure out when Congress can regulate, when it can't. And the Supreme Court attempted to define when it can and when it can't for us. And in some ways, the federal government got a little bit of power back as a result of certain cases. So let's define it. So it's closely related to direct and indirect effects, and it gives the federal government the power to regulate things that drop in and out of interstate commerce. So a thing goes into interstate commerce, it drops out of it, and the transaction occurs wholly within a state, and then it goes back into interstate commerce. But these things were always intended for the interstate market. I know that may sound confusing, but let me give you an example. Cows. Okay, when does a cow enter an interstate commerce market? Well, it enters interstate commerce, or the stream of interstate commerce, when it's driven across a state border. Now, back in the day, of course, cows primarily were raised on large ranches out in the West, and those people running cows would collect them up and they would drive them from, say, Colorado or Wyoming and other states across state borders to cow towns like Kansas City and Fort Worth. These cows would, quote unquote, come to rest in these cow towns, but they would only do so for the purpose of selling them to meat packers. So, and it was a very complex sort of transaction. The people who own the cows, the cow drivers, the people who raise the cows, would sell their cows to people who were commission men. They called them commission men. They'd sell them to the commission men, and the commission men would then turn around and sell those cows to meat packers. Now, those transactions would occur wholly within the town of Fort Worth or the town of Kansas City. In other words, it is an intrastate commercial transaction. The meat packers wanted to argue that the federal government couldn't regulate them because those transactions were not interstate. They were occurring intrastate. They were occurring solely within a state. And let me tell you, these meat packers and the commission men, they were all corrupt, and it was rife with corruption. They were, in many ways, they were jacking up, they were lowering the prices for the cattle drivers and then jacking them up for the consumers. And the federal government attempted to come in and regulate them and set prices and the price of shipping and the price of meat per pound and things to protect the cattle drivers and protect the consumers. And the meat packers didn't like this, so they sued. So these cows only came to rest in this town as a result of, for the purpose of selling them to meat packers. Once the cows were repackaged, so to speak, for transportation to the east and also to the north and south, they re-entered the stream of commerce. The Supreme Court said that once a thing was in the stream of commerce, it was always in that stream of commerce. It didn't fall out of it. Well, it did, but Congress can continue to regulate it once it has entered a stream. It doesn't matter that the cow was driven across a state boundary and then was sold within a state. It was always intended for the interstate market. Here are some stream of commerce cases. Swift versus United States actually established the doctrine and said that when anything enters the stream of interstate commerce, it is interstate commerce. Stafford v. Wallace was the case I was alluding to about the meat packers. And the court in that case says that the key is where the product is going. Where does it the final resting place? Where is that intended? Did when the cattle drivers sold the cows in one of the cow towns, was that the final destination for the cow? No, the final destination was in the stomachs of someone living in New York City. Chicago Board of Trade v. Olson, grain exchanges were the same sort of thing. Farmers would sell their grain to those people who stored them. They'd sell them for so much per unit, and then these individuals would store them in these huge grain elevators, and then charge the farmers a fee for transporting the grain out of state. It's exactly the same sort of thing. It's just grain isn't on the hoof. And these sorts of exchanges were part of interstate commerce. But there were still some cases where Congress had no power. Labor was never considered part of the stream of commerce. Never considered part of it. So let's look at the regulating commerce as part of a federal quote-unquote police power. Now, the police power is largely associated with the states. This is an extremely important concept. Police power is largely associated with the states. It is the ancient power of the state to regulate for the health, safety, morals, and general welfare. This is usually considered a state power. The police power is not part of the federal government's constitutional power, but the federal government can exercise a type of police power so long as it is able to identify an enumerated, implied, or inherent power to carry it out. So, for example, President Lincoln, when he blockaded the southern ports, he was actually acting for the general public good to quell an insurrection. And he could point to an inherent power of the presidency in exercising that power to blockade southern ports. But the federal government, whenever it regulates anything, in particular when it has a public purpose in mind, in doing so in the name of the public good, it has to identify a power. Champion v. Ames is a good example. Okay, so this was a case involving the transportation of lottery tickets. And then Congress had prohibited the interstate shipment of lottery tickets, because there was a lot of fraud and corruption associated with it. And someone sent these tickets through the United States mail, and he was charged with a crime. And he said, no, you can't do that. That's not part of commerce. I'm not actually transacting. The transaction occurs within the states, not when I ship the lottery tickets. The court said that the federal government may use its commerce power to police lottery tickets, their movement from one state to another by independent carriers. That doesn't make much sense. Why? Well, the court said the law doesn't interfere with the internal workings of the state. It just interferes with the shipment of a good in interstate. It affects only matters that involve the people of the United States, and the federal government can act to stop that where it involves the morals of a people. At the time, gambling and participating in lotteries was considered immoral. Hammer v. Dagenhart, I told you we'd come back to this one. In this case, we're talking about Congress's attempt to exclude goods that were made using child labor from the interstate market. All right, so Congress says we're not going to allow goods that were manufactured by children to enter the interstate market for the purposes of sale. So they're not actually regulating the child labor, they're regulating the good. And the question there was, may Congress use its power to control interstate commerce to force the states to abide by a uniform standard of labor, to stop child labor? The court says no. And Justice Day writes the opinion, and he says, the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, not to control the states in their exercise of the police power over local trade and manufacture. If anyone was going to stop child labor, it was going to be the states. Here is why Congress wanted to regulate it, though. It wasn't so much that Congress cared about the fates of these children. Children were cheap labor, and some states allowed child labor, and that gave businesses manufacturing in those states a decided advantage over states that didn't allow child labor, over companies incorporated in states and doing business in states that didn't allow child labor. So it was a way of leveling the playing field. Hammer was the U.S. attorney that was going to enforce the law, so he gets sued, and really it was a way to, it was collusion, actually. The Dagenharts were the children. Actually, Dagenhart was the father of the children who weren't allowed to work, and the company that they worked for actually went to him and said, hey, would you mind suing Hammer, suing the United States government to prevent enforcement of this law, because we really like child labor. And you can see in the text that the Dagenharts really didn't get much out of it. The court sees this as a states' rights case rather than a free market case. Let's read a little bit about what Justice Day said. He said, the maintenance of the authority of the states over matters purely local is essential to the preservation of our institutions. In other words, he's talking about federalism. He may not like child labor. He even says, I don't like child labor. But he says, Congress is not the government to regulate it. He states that if we allow this regulation, freedom of commerce will end, and, horror of horrors, state power to regulate internal affairs will cease. Justice Holmes dissents, and he doesn't make a new argument. He uses the direct and indirect effects doctrine and the stream of commerce doctrine to make this argument. But he says it's the right doctrine, but the court has misapplied it. In this case, when a good is actually in the stream of commerce, it's actually being sold, the federal government can exclude those goods, can regulate those goods. And that's what they were doing. They weren't regulating child labor directly. They were regulating the goods on the market. Once a good crosses a state border, it is no longer wholly in character. The character of the good has a direct influence on actual commerce. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I know this is a very complex topic.